I've got a golden rule for you. So every single environment must be always the same. Never forget this. So dev, staging, prod, all identical, full stop. Do you believe it? A blanket statement like this are as useful as an ashtray on a motorbike. Hi, I'm Anto and this is Out of DevOps, a YouTube channel for software engineers. Today we're going to discuss how to manage multiple environments using infrastructure as code. For me, every environment is always different. It is a bit like eventual consistency. So something eventually will be consistent, but the reality of the facts is that they are never consistent. So environments generally are created because they need to serve different purposes, so they will be different in their nature, and that's why they tend to diverge. So for me, instead of following a blanket statement like the one before, it's more important to stick to the principles behind them, which are reliability and compliance. So let's try to understand where the environment requirement comes from. So a few years ago, the application architecture was a little bit different from what we have today. It was very common to see an application being a single executable deployed on multiple machines, and in that scenario, it comes natural to think that it's a good thing to have every single machine identical, and it's also much easier to control this. But if you shift everything to today, where we have microservices architecture, where each microservice is developed in isolation by another team, probably using a different stack and being deployed in different ways, it's very complex to keep environment identical. There is also another factor to consider, which is the life cycle of each microservice, and also the different schedules in updates and releases. Understanding that microservices may have different update schedule can help us understanding why environment tend to diverge. Let's start with an example. Let's assume in our company we have a microservices architecture. We have two teams developing two microservices. They have their own schedule, and we have our infrastructure in the cloud. So now the code is the application. Each application has its own code in a Git repository, and the infrastructure is defined in its own repository. So now we want to release changes for team 1 and team 2. They both have a change to the application, but team 1 also has a change to the architecture, so it will have an impact on the underlying infrastructure. So they both release in dev, and they both release in staging, but for team 1 they realize that there is an issue, so they need to go back in development, so they cannot proceed with the upgrade of production. In the meantime, team 2 is ready for production release, so they release in production. So now if you look at this, because team 1 also had infrastructure changes, you have already two different type of environments. So environments already diverged. You have dev and staging being exact copies, but production is not identical to staging. So now in this simple scenario, we can already see that the golden rule is broken. But if we try to move forward by one sprint, let's analyze this following scenario. So we have now team 1 still trying to figure out what's the problem with the application, so they cannot progress to production, and team 2 now has another change, and this change this time also includes infrastructure changes. So now we have two options. So team 2 can decide to wait and release once team 1 is ready, or apply, but obviously to avoid that production is impacted, create a condition in the infrastructure as code to avoid that the changes from team 1 are applied to production. Obviously, we both know that waiting is not an option for the business, so we're going to go with the second option. So we're going to create a condition in our infrastructure as code, and then we're going to apply the changes from team 2 into the infrastructure. So now, if we analyze the environments, what we're going to have is quite funny, because we have dev and staging that are identical, because we applied all the same infrastructure changes at the same time, following the right order. But if you look at production, now contains a change from team 2 that has been applied in dev and staging on a different infrastructure, because dev and staging also had the change from team 1 that was stopped at staging. So now when team 1 is going to be ready to apply, they will apply for the first time on an environment that has never been tested before. So we wanted to have every single environment to be identical, and we almost achieved that. except for the fact that the most important one, the production environment, diverged and is different. So let's see how we can mitigate this situation. What I generally do, instead of working at environment level, so considering an entire environment, I work at component level. What I mean component level, so I try to split the infrastructure into infrastructure components that can be managed in isolation, can be tested in isolation. So, and the next thing I try to do is, instead of taking a snapshot of an environment and trying to replicate that snapshot in a higher environment, I try to compose environment using this infrastructure component. So what I'm gonna do now is relax a little bit the golden rule. So instead of considering the golden rule being every single environment must be identical, I would say every single environment must be composed of infrastructure components that have been promoted from lower environments. So what do I mean? So now we are allowing environment to contain different components as long as every single component has been battle tested before being deployed, even in development. So this is going to have important implications, because one, we need to define a proper software development lifecycle for infrastructure component, and this means we also need to make sure we test every single component before we deploy, even in dev. So from this point of view, from the infrastructure component point of view, there is no difference between dev, staging and prod. They will be all considered production environments for an infrastructure component. So we need to have another place where we can test different scenarios for our components. So the other thing to consider is also how to manage the infrastructure as code repositories and how to manage promotion across environments. So when you want to promote now the environment, you are going to promote individual components in each environment. So you need to keep all these things in mind when you design your repositories and when you design your rollout strategy. So this is it. Let me know if you have questions, and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and see you soon. Bye.